In this video, I'm going to bring together some of my thoughts on the topic of free will. I've been pondering this issue on and off for the past several years, and my perspectives are, in many regards, unique. I hold to an indeterministic conception of free will, which would probably be considered libertarian by many, although, as we shall see, I have developed some reservations about using that term. The plan for this video is as follows. First, I will offer a brief overview of the contemporary options in the free will debate and get some working definitions on the table. I will explain why I am not overly fond of the way in which the debate is currently framed, nor do I care much about the debate between compatibilists and incompatibilists. I will then present what I take to be the most plausible account of free will, namely an agent-causal account. I will present an original, although certainly not decisive argument, for why we should think that this account is true. Finally, I shall address the two most common objections to agent-causal indeterminism. First, I will explore and reject the idea that this account of free will is incoherent and reduces to random chance. Second, I shall critique the notion that scientific developments in neuroscience have shown that our decisions are predetermined. I want to be transparent about the fact that I do not consider myself an expert on the subject of free will. I know my way around the major issues, but I have not by any means spent years engaging the most cutting-edge research in this field. I will cite from sources which I have found helpful throughout this video, but many of the ideas and arguments presented in this video are, as far as I know, original to me. This means that they have not been tested against the fires of contemporary analytic philosophy. I think that my ideas have merit and deserve consideration, but it could turn out to be the case that none of what I have to say holds up. So all of the conclusions which I reach in this video are held somewhat tentatively. However, we will never know if these ideas will hold up unless they are put out there to be scrutinized by others. So this video is my attempt to do just that. I present for you my own theory of free will, along with my reasons for adopting it. The contemporary landscape of analytic philosophy is divided into roughly three camps when it comes to free will. These are libertarianism, hard determinism, and compatibilism. These three options emerge as the possible candidates as the result of the following inconsistent triad. 1. We have free will. 2. Determinism is true. 3. Free will and determinism are incompatible. One cannot logically accept all three of these positions without contradiction. If you accept any two of these options, you must reject the other one. Libertarianism accepts 1 and 3, and it rejects 2. It is an incompatibilist theory, meaning that it takes freedom and determinism to be incompatible with one another. Libertarianism further accepts that we do have free will, and so the conjunction of these theses that we do have free will and that incompatibilism is true together entail that determinism is false. As Robert Kane explains, those who are convinced that there is a conflict between free will and determinism are called incompatibilists about free will. They believe free will and determinism are incompatible. If incompatibilists also believe that an incompatibilist free will exists, so that determinism is false, they are called libertarians about free will. Hard determinism accepts 2 and 3 and rejects 1. Hard determinists agree with libertarians that incompatibilism is true. Free will is not compatible with determinism. But they disagree with libertarians on whether or not determinism is false. Instead, they take determinism to be true, and so the conjunction of the theses that determinism is true and that incompatibilism is true entails that we do not have free will. As Dirk Pereboom explains, hard determinists argue that moral responsibility is incompatible with determinism, and because determinism is true, we lack the sort of free will required for moral responsibility. And finally, there is compatibilism, which rejects 3, and so can accept both 1 and 2. Compatibilists maintain that freedom and determinism are compatible with one another, and so the foundational assumption of both libertarianism and hard determinism is false. It's important to note that compatibilists are not necessarily committed to saying that determinism is actually true. One might think that we have free will and that determinism is false, but also think that we could still have free will even if determinism were true. Guillaume Bignon reminds us, compatibilism is the thesis that determinism is compatible with moral responsibility. Note that compatibilism, in itself, says nothing about the truth of either determinism or moral responsibility. It only says that both could be true together, that they are compossible. More often than not, philosophers who affirm compatibilism do so because they do maintain the truth of the two theses, and if both are true, then surely they are compatible. But theoretically, one could be a compatibilist and yet reject determinism or moral responsibility or both. Similarly, Kevin Timpe says, it is important to keep in mind that both compatibilism and incompatibilism are claims about possibility. According to the compatibilist, it is possible that an agent is both fully determined and yet free. The incompatibilist, on the other hand, maintains that such a state of affairs is impossible and that free will is possible only if determinism is false. But neither position, by itself, is making a claim about whether or not agents actually do possess free will. It is also important to keep in mind that compatibilism makes no claim about whether or not determinism is true. So that's a very brief overview of the major options in the free will debate. One of the more frustrating facts about the literature on the subject of free will, in my opinion, is that it is so cluttered with discussions regarding whether or not free will and determinism are compatible with one another. Arguably, that is the central question for philosophers at present. The problem for me is that I fundamentally just don't care about this issue all that much. I'm interested in whether or not determinism is true. What first sparked my interest in this issue was when I began reflecting upon my own choices in life and began wondering if I categorically could have acted differently than I in fact did. I was never concerned with the question of whether there was some sense in which I could still consider my choices to be free, even if determinism were true. I find that question thoroughly uninteresting. I think that part of the problem here lies in how the issue is typically framed. The question that usually gets asked first is, do we have free will? This immediately leads to a debate over compatibilism, because those who are asking the question often assume that if determinism were true, then we would not have free will. So the compatibilist takes it that the whole question may include a question-begging assumption, and round the compatibilists and incompatibilists go. But all of that is fundamentally uninteresting to me. I'd be happy enough to grant, at least for the sake of argument, that there is some understanding of freedom which is going to be compatible with determinism. After all, one can define words however they want. I'm sure that one can define freedom in such a way that it is trivially compatible with determinism. But that's never what I cared about. I want to know if determinism is true. Discovering that I might be able to have freedom, even if determinism were true, does nothing to answer that original curiosity. So instead of asking the question, do we have free will, I instead want to ask, is determinism true, or more precisely, are my choices determined? This would, I think, center the debate on a far more interesting topic. John Searle is a good example of a philosopher who sets the free will question up in the way I would prefer, saying, we have to assume that there are causal antecedents to our actions. The question is, are those causal antecedents, in every case, sufficient to determine the action, or are there some cases where they are not sufficient, and if so, how do we account for those cases? This, in brief, indicates why I don't really like how the debate is currently structured, as well as why I don't prefer to call myself a libertarian anymore. To the extent that libertarianism entails a commitment to incompatibilism, I am agnostic towards it. Nevertheless, I do think that we have free will, and I think that determinism is false. Therefore, even though I share considerable ground with libertarians, throughout this video, I will refer to my position as indeterminism rather than libertarianism. However, I think that my model is fully compatible with libertarianism, and that libertarians will agree with many of my conclusions. I quite like the way that David Hodgson mirrors my own sentiments when he says, the compatibilism of free will and responsibility with determinism, the consequence argument, and the direct argument are almost certainly beside the point, because almost certainly determinism is false. So now that I've said something about the fact that I dislike how the contemporary debate over free will is typically structured in terms of the compatibility question, let me proceed to develop my own indeterministic account of free will. Indeterminists typically fall into one of two camps when it comes to the question of how people freely cause their choices. These are event-causal theories of free will and agent-causal theories of free will. The difference here regards whether we should think of events as being the only type of causes within our ontology, or whether we should introduce a fundamentally different type of entity known as agents, which are endowed with sui generis causal powers. Timpe explains, the fundamental disagreement concerns how an agent causes her free choices. The relevant issue at present is regarding the relata of the causal relation, that is, what kinds of things are being related by the causal relation. More specifically, when an agent freely wills to do a particular action, to what ontological category do the relata belong? And Peter van Inwagen adds, agent causation is, or is supposed to be, a relation that agents, thinking or rational substances, bear to events. Agent causation is opposed to event causation, a relation that events bear to events. The friends of agent causation hold that the causes of some events are not, or are only partially, earlier events. They are, rather, substances. Now, I am not here interested in pursuing the debate between event-causal theories of free will and their agent-causal counterparts. I merely bring this issue up to locate my own position within the broader free will debate. In contrast to the currently more popular event-causal theories of free will, my own account of free will is a staunchly agent-causal theory of free will. Now, among those who hold to agent causation, there are a variety of subcategories into which they can fall. I am not interested in surveying that debate in this video either, but suffice to say that I am largely in agreement with Timothy O'Connor's version of agent causation. I think that he has provided the most plausible and most attractive account of agent causation. He explains it as follows. A particular that freely and directly brings about an effect has to be an agent that can represent possible courses of action to himself and have desires and beliefs concerning those alternatives. Agent causes bring about immediately executive states. This direct causing by agents of states of intention goes like this. Parallel to event causes, the distinctive capacities of agent causes, active powers, are grounded in a property or set of properties. So any agent having the relevant internal properties will have it directly within his power to cause any of the range of states of intention delimited by internal and external circumstances. However, these properties function differently in the associated causal process. Instead of being associated with functions from circumstances to effects, they, in conjunction with appropriate circumstances, make possible the agent's producing an effect. These choice-enabling properties ground a different type of causal power or capacity, one that in suitable circumstances is freely exercised by the agent himself. The most common objections to agent causation have centrally to do with its intelligibility. It is common to find critics of agent causation demanding an explanation for how it works and of the mechanics involved. My own preferred response to these sorts of challenges is to insist that the causal relation between agent and decision is direct and simple, that is, incapable of being broken down into more fundamental parts. An agent is capable of directly producing a decision without any intervening mechanisms whatsoever. This will, of course, not be very satisfying to the critic. But if the tables were turned, and I were to ask him to explain how causation between events works, sooner or later, his account would also have to bottom out in a brute causal relation between events. The simple fact is that explanation cannot go on forever. Eventually it ends somewhere. And if that is right, then there is nothing at all wrong with the proponent of agent causation, saying that an agent's directly causing an event is the end of the causal story. No further explanation of the mechanism is needed or required. As Randolph Clark observes, one response to the problem is to say that the notion of event causation is no less mysterious. The problem of intelligibility, it is said, stems from the concept of causation. It is a problem that must be faced by anyone who makes use of the concept of causation at all. When an agent causes an event, the relation in which the agent stands to that event is the very same one in which one event stands to another when the first causes the second. There is nothing more to an instance of direct agent causation, there is no more to how it works, than there is to how an instance of direct event causation works. But perhaps the skeptic will still press the question of what explains why this decision was made and not another. Why did an agent choose this instead of that? Surely there must be some explanation for this. The answer to such questions, from an agent-causal perspective, is to reaffirm that the agent himself explains why this decision was made and not another, and that there is not a further causal explanation. This is not to say that there cannot be other sorts of explanations. For example, preferences or inclinations might help to explain why one decision was made over another. But according to agent causation, these sorts of entities are not responsible for causing the decision which is made, or if they are causally involved in some way, then, at the very least, they do not constitute a sufficient causal explanation. That is to say, whatever causal role such factors play in explaining a choice is not sufficient to bring the choice about without the role of the agent. The agent plays an ineliminable role in causing the decision to be made. For the skeptic to insist upon a further explanation than this is for them to beg the question against agent causation. If the agent themselves is not a satisfactory answer, then the skeptic is effectively just assuming that there has to be some other determining factor, and, consequently, they are simply assuming the truth of determinism a priori. As Timothy O'Connor argues, pointing to that fact in the present context begs the question of the possibility of agent causation, however. Agent causes operate differently, so it is unsurprising that this difference is matched by a difference in the way they are involved in the explanation of their effects. An agent cause does not produce certain effects in consequence of its very nature, as does an event cause. It does so freely in view of considerations accessible to the agent at that time. An explanation for why an agent-caused event occurred will include, among other things, an account of the reasons on which an agent acted. There is no obvious incoherence in the agent-causationist view that an agent causes an event. Certain reasons he had at the time explain why this event occurred, despite the fact that these reasons don't also explain every contrastive fact about the event. Perhaps the most serious objection against agent causation in particular regards the complete otherness of the sort of entity which it posits. After all, these hypothesized agents, with sui generis active power to directly cause decisions without any intervening mechanisms, are quite different from anything else in the physical world which we study. As Alfred Millet says, the empirical claim and hypotheses to be discussed provide no support specifically for the existence of agent-causal powers. So then, the critic might ask, why should we incorporate this wholly different type of entity into our ontology? It might be possible to remove some of the perceived difficulty by pointing out that conscious beings already possess a host of other properties and abilities which are foreign to anything else in the physical world. Conscious beings can have phenomenal experiences like pain and pleasure. They can perceive other objects in the world. They can form thoughts and beliefs, intentions and desires, and so on and so forth. So the proponent of agent causation can just say that since we already know that conscious beings possess a host of abilities which are not possessed by ordinary physical objects, it would not be all that surprising if they possessed one more, namely the active powers which make them agents. In other words, we already know that conscious beings are unlike anything else in our experience. Agent causation merely proposes that they are unlike anything else in another way. I think that this is helpful as far as it goes, but I think that the proponent of agent causation can go further than this by arguing that the determinist is also committed to the existence of something with agent-like causal powers. Consider that most determinists do not think that the causal or deterministic chain leading from the beginning of the universe up to today goes on infinitely. Infinite causal regresses are philosophically problematic because causation is essentially transitive. If a chain of causes goes on infinitely, then it seems that there is nowhere for the causation to originate in order to be transferred along the causal chain. So if causal chains have to be finite, then the causal chain which led up to our actions today also has to be finite. And this leads us to the conclusion that whatever was the very first event in that causal chain could not have been determined by some prior cause. This should be an entirely unobjectionable conclusion for theists who maintain that God is the uncaused first cause of the universe. But even for those who don't believe in God, the fact remains that the very first event had to be an uncaused first cause of all the events which followed from it. Obviously, this first cause need not be an agent, although theists will want to maintain that it is, but at the very least, the uncaused first cause had the ability to act without being caused to do so by something else. And this means that at least one uncaused first cause has to exist. So then, by positing that conscious beings are the uncaused first causes of their own decisions, the defender of agent causation is not introducing a fundamentally new thing into our ontology. We independently know that at least one uncaused first cause must exist, and so this opens the door to the possibility that other uncaused first causes, what I am calling agents, likewise exist. Even a hard determinist like Dirk Pereboom agrees, saying, "Now if one is accustomed to causal explanations adducing only events, as perhaps we all are, it will seem strange that a causal explanation would avert not to events, but only to an agent, or an agent by virtue of a causal power. But this sort of explanation, I think, is no stranger than the hypothesis that agents fundamentally are causes. One might propose that because such explanations are not featured in mature sciences, they are thereby ruled out. However, this verdict assumes that these sciences allow us to understand the notion of explanation well enough to rule out agent-causal explanation. In my view, the strangeness of agent-causal explanations should, perhaps, make one wary of them, but it does not support an argument that agent-causal libertarianism is incoherent. Okay, so having explained that my theory of free will is overtly an agent-causal theory, I can now develop the unique features of my theory. As noted earlier, the account of free will which I am proposing is decidedly indeterministic. That is to say, I take a free decision to be one which categorically could have been different given the exact same history leading up to it. Such decisions are not caused or determined or fixed by the events which precede them. When we make conscious decisions on this view, we have a categorical ability to choose differently. We could have done otherwise. It's important to emphasize that my theory of free will says that conscious decisions are free when they are indeterministic. I have no interest in defending bare indeterminism, the thesis that some events are not determined. One might think that spontaneous quantum events, for example, are indeterministic. Indeed, most contemporary physicists believe that they are. But if the sort of indeterminism observed on the quantum level is the sort of free will that we possess, then this is hardly grounds for excitement, as Robert Kane observes. Suppose a choice was the result of a quantum jump or other undetermined event in a person's brain. Would this amount to a free and responsible choice? Such undetermined effects in the brain or body would be unpredictable and impulsive, like the sudden occurrence of a thought or the spasmodic jerking of an arm that one could not have predicted or influenced, quite the opposite of what we take free and responsible actions to be. It seems that undetermined events happening in the brain or the body would occur spontaneously, and would be more likely to undermine our freedom rather than to enhance our freedom. If the leading theories in quantum mechanics are right, then in some trivial sense, determinism could be false. However, this would leave open the question of whether or not human decisions are determined. It could be the case that so-called near-determinism is true, and that, although micro-level quantum events are not determined, all macro-level events, including human decisions, the sorts of things which we really care about, are entirely determined. As Ted Honderich explains, near-determinism allows that there is, or may be, some indeterminism, but only at what is called the micro level of our existence, the level of the small particles of our bodies, particles of the kind studied by physics. At the ordinary level of choices and actions, and even ordinary electrochemical activity in our brains, causal laws govern what happens. It's all cause and effect in what you might call the real world. I have no interest in that sort of indeterminism which, for all practical purposes, is identical to determinism. So the sort of indeterminism which my account of free will embraces is a robust and non-trivial type of indeterminism. Specifically, it says that intentional human decisions are not determined. As David Hodgson puts it, on the view I am proposing, we can, particularly in circumstances of attention, concentration, deliberation, and/or effort, make significant choices as to what to do, choices that are not wholly predetermined by pre-choice circumstances, including pre-choice states and processes of our brains, the laws of nature, and/or computational rules. There is nothing external to us, or for which we are not responsible, that is a sufficient cause of these decisions or actions so that we can be considered, at least in part, the ultimate source of them and ultimately responsible for them. In this way, I contend, we do have substantial indeterministic free will and responsibility. I refer to my own theory as a simple theory of free will. It consists of just two conditions. 1. Human beings make deliberate decisions. 2. These decisions are not, or at least not usually, determined. One nice thing about the account of free will which I am proposing is that it doesn't conceive of free will as being this new or mysterious thing, which is being added to what we already know about human beings, and therefore needing some special sort of evidence to support it. Notice that the first condition is already widely accepted by almost everyone within this debate. Virtually no one seriously disputes the fact that human beings do make deliberate decisions. The debate regards whether or not those decisions are determined. Do human beings have a categorical ability to do otherwise? It is the determinist who is claiming that there is this other thing which exists in addition to the deliberate decision, namely a relation of determination between the decision and the events leading up to it. I am inclined to this theory of free will because it only appeals to something which is widely acknowledged to exist, and also because it puts the burden of proof on the determinist to explain why we should think that there is a relation of determination which holds antecedently to a deliberate decision. But I think that we can do more than merely ask the determinist to justify determinism. In this next section, I want to go further and argue that we actually have reason to prefer indeterminism over determinism. It is a matter of some controversy whether or not there is any epistemic justification to be had for those who affirm an indeterministic understanding of free will, as I have described it. This is controversial even among those who believe in indeterminism. For example, John Lemos, who is himself a libertarian, expresses pessimism about the prospect of justifying belief in a libertarian understanding of free will. He says, "It is my view that, in this point in time, we simply don't have sufficient experimental empirical evidence, nor sufficient metaphysical nor logical nor intuitive evidence to establish that libertarian free will exists." Similarly, Kevin Timpe, also a libertarian, says, "Most philosophers agree that whether or not determinism is true is a contingent matter. That is, determinism is neither necessarily true nor necessarily false. If this is so, Whether or not determinism is true becomes an empirical matter to be discovered by investigating the way the world is, not through philosophical argumentation. Is the actual world deterministic? I do not know. During the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, most philosophers and scientists thought it was, but the contemporary scientific consensus seems to go the other way. Yet another libertarian, Randolph Clark, has the most gloomy comments of all, saying, "Perhaps the best that can be said for libertarianism here is that, given the demise of classical mechanics and electromagnetic theory, there is no good evidence that determinism is true. If our beliefs on the issue are to be, as I think they should be, guided by the evidence, then we will leave the question open whether we have what is characterized by any libertarian view. We will accept, then, that perhaps we never have more than one course of action open to us at any given time, and we never exercise any greater degree of active control than what can be characterized by a compatibilist account. If this is in fact so, then we have never actually possessed something that many of us thought we had, and something that we may reasonably value. Though not the end of the world, neither is that a matter of indifference." In this next portion of the video, I wish to respectfully disagree with Lemos, Timpe, Clark, and those who share this general pessimism. What follows is a modest abductive argument for the reality of indeterministic freedom. I shall begin by attempting to precisely define some key terms so that it is clear what I am and what I am not defending. After this, I shall give a brief overview of abductive reasoning. Next, I shall lay out my argument for indeterminism, which, if successful, will be sufficient to warrant belief in indeterministic freedom without having to do anything more than reflect upon the relations involved in everyday experience. Finally, I shall endeavor to anticipate and answer some potential objections to my argument. Indeterminism stands in contrast to determinism. Determinism can be roughly defined as follows: the thesis that all actions and events are determined by prior conditions. Determinism can be parsed out in a variety of ways, but it seems to me to essentially require that all actions and events stand in a causal or determination relation to one another, such that all subsequent actions and events are caused by prior actions and events. An imperfect and crude illustration of this idea might be a row of falling dominoes, where each domino in the chain is caused to fall by the prior domino. Obviously, I do not mean to suggest that determinists believe that human actions are no different than falling dominoes. But I think it is fair to say that they view human actions, like the chain of dominoes, as being causally or deterministically related to the conditions which precede them and which follow them. Perhaps one caveat is in order here. Determinists may want to leave open the possibility that the causal chain of history has a beginning, and that the first action or event, whatever that might have been, was itself not caused by prior conditions. If this caveat is accepted by the determinist, then we must modify our definition of determinism accordingly. This modified definition would understand determinism as the thesis that all actions and events, since the first action or event, are determined by prior conditions. To get a visual illustration to understand the basic thrust of what I am saying, we may envisage a cluster of dots extended horizontally and completely connected to each other for their entire length by short lines, forming a shape resembling a sideways tree. The horizontal structure here represents the flow of time. The dots represent each and every action and event which transpires within time. Finally, the short lines represent causal or deterministic relations which hold between earlier events and later events. Now, the indeterminist wants to deny the accuracy of this picture. The indeterminist affirms portions of it. He accepts all of the dots and some of the lines between them. He believes that some events, and perhaps some actions, are caused by prior events, but he denies that this is the case across the board. He sees some causal chains of events as causally unconnected to other causal chains of events. Some causal chains terminate in agents which are themselves not caused to act by anything. They are the uncaused first causes of their decisions. The causal connectedness of all actions and events seems to me to be the main disagreement between determinists and their indeterminist counterparts. Accordingly, we may roughly define indeterministic free will as follows: the thesis that in at least some cases, the conditions which precede a person's choice are insufficient to cause or determine that choice rather than another. Now, to adjudicate between determinism and indeterminism, I propose that we use abduction. Abduction, also known as inference to the best explanation, is one of our most commonly used forms of reasoning. We often rely on it without even consciously realizing that we are doing so. Consequently, much of what I say in this section may seem obvious and even unnecessary, but analyzing this familiar form of reasoning will prove useful. By sharpening our understanding of what makes an explanation the best explanation, it will become easier to see why I take indeterminism to be the best explanation of certain data points. Roughly, abductive reasoning accepts a set of evidence or data points and then posits several different possible explanations for why the evidence is as it is, as opposed to some other way. It then selects from among the different hypotheses the hypothesis which best explains that evidence. How is one to determine which explanation is the best explanation for any given body of evidence? Philosophers have proposed various criteria which, if fulfilled by one hypothesis and not others, helps to adjudicate among competing hypotheses. These criteria include explanatory power. An explanation is better if it explains more of the evidence. Parsimony. An explanation is better if it is more plausible given one's background beliefs. Simplicity. An explanation is better if it doesn't require you to posit the existence of other ad hoc entities, or does not require you to accept new beliefs which lack independent evidence. For the purposes of this video, we will primarily be concerned with the criterion of simplicity. Specifically, I want to contend that indeterminism is a simpler hypothesis than determinism, and this, in turn, makes it more likely to be true than determinism, assuming all other things stand equal between the two hypotheses. Perhaps someone might wonder why a simpler hypothesis is, in fact, a more probable explanation. Joshua Rasmussen responds to this concern as follows. The answer, the reason the simpler hypothesis is more internally probable, is that the simpler hypothesis includes less total information and so has fewer ways to go wrong. Consider the following example. Suppose that you leave a stack of 100 $1 bills on the table next to your bed. You leave the room and lock the door. Upon returning to your room, you discovered that the window is open and that the money is gone. One hypothesis, which explains the evidence, is that a single burglar has opened the window and stolen the entire stack of money. However, it is also possible that in the time that you were gone, 100 burglars independently broke in and each took only $1. Clearly, the hypothesis that there was only one burglar is simpler, and therefore, this hypothesis ought to be preferred. A fuller defense of the criterion of simplicity would require a video of its own, and such a task would take us far afield. Fortunately, this criterion is fairly uncontroversial among contemporary philosophers, and so I will assume it for the remainder of this argument. Having defined my terms and explained the criteria for a best explanation, I will now proceed to argue that indeterminism is the best explanation for all of the available data relevant to our choices. I begin with the observation that, when I reflect upon the possible choices which I consider making in any given situation, I am acquainted with open alternative possibilities or alternative options. But what exactly is an open alternative option? I shall be using the term in a technical sense, which I define as a possible state of affairs which, as far as one knows, one has it within their power to make actual. Importantly, I am referring here to epistemic possibility, that is, the sort of possibility which may be actual relative to what one knows. So, for example, relative to what I know, it is possible that it will rain tomorrow. Obviously, it either actually will rain or it actually will not. But when I deliberate over whether or not it will rain tomorrow, both are epistemically possible since, in this hypothetical, I have no access to what will actually happen. Similarly, when I deliberate over the actions which I will perform, for example, whether or not I will skip breakfast, both are epistemically possible since I have no access to what will actually happen. This is important because determinists generally agree that epistemic possibilities are real. As such, I avoid begging the question against determinism when I say that I am acquainted with open alternative possibilities. I am not presupposing a categorical ability to actualize any of them, only that I can actualize any of them as far as I know. These observations, drawn from reflection upon my own experience of acting, form the basis of a modest argument that I do indeed act in an indeterministic fashion. As Alfred Millais points out, Betty may experience her deliberation as aimed at settling which of two open options she will select, an experience seemingly relevant to her satisfying the indeterministic condition at issue. If the best explanation of Betty's experience of openness were that she is internally indeterministic, her having that experience would provide grounds for the judgment that she is internally indeterministic. Now, Millais goes on to explain that he does not believe that a good argument has yet been given for indeterminism being the best explanation of our experience of open options, but I think that I can provide such an argument. Observe that when I choose to actualize a given option, in addition to open alternative possibilities, I am also acquainted with the sufficient causal relation between myself and my actions. That is to say, I am the cause of my own actions. As Richard Swinburne says, I could not try to do any action, basic or non-basic, unless I believed at the time that my trying was causally influential. Now, the determinist should be able to agree with this, but he wants to add something further. He wishes to maintain that, in addition to me causing my actions, antecedent conditions prior to my choice in some way sufficiently determined me to choose as I did. The indeterminist denies such a sufficient deterministic link between the prior conditions and the choice. It is important to understand that determinism requires these deterministic relations to be real things, for otherwise there is not a sufficient explanation for how antecedent events determine subsequent events. As Richard Franklin explains, determinism, as a philosophical doctrine, extends to every aspect of all choices. It may, therefore, be defined as the denial of the occurrence of undetermined events such as the libertarian asserts. That is, it is the assertion that every total situation is a sufficient condition for what follows it, that there is always some true proposition, even if unknown, which asserts or entails that whenever this X, then this Y. The account, which may fairly be called traditional, offers an analysis of causation containing three fundamental features. First, it assumes that both cause and effect are events. Secondly, the events must be in a temporal relation of immediate succession. Thirdly, the event which is the cause must be at least a sufficient condition for the effect. Doubtless Franklin goes too far when he says that the relations to which determinists are committed must be construed as causal relations. Many determinists prefer to think that the determination consists in something other than causation, but even so, there must be some sort of determining relation in virtue of which prior events cause our actions. But when I actually make decisions, it would seem that I am not aware of that relation which the determinist is claiming exists. The determinist, then, is adding something further to our ontology, namely a sufficient causal or deterministic relation between the antecedent conditions of my choice and my choice. But this adds unnecessary complexity to our ontology. Moreover, it adds it to a very high degree, since determinism entails that these deterministic relations hold prior to each and every human decision. But we are not acquainted with this sufficient causal relation, and consequently, one wonders what justification exists for supposing that it exists at all. By removing a good many of these determination relations from the picture, the indeterminist can offer a substantially simpler ontology than the determinist. Indeterminism thus entails the existence of fewer entities. Therefore, indeterminism is the simpler hypothesis. So, by inference to the best explanation, and assuming that all other things stand equal between determinism and indeterminism, indeterminism is intrinsically more likely to be true. As such, we are justified in believing that determinism is false unless and until determinists can bring some sort of arguments or evidence for the truth of determinism. As Thad Botham says, suppose that two theories, A and B, compete in accounting for a given range of intuitive data. Suppose also that they account for this data equally well. However, suppose that the number of theory A's conceptual primitives is less than the number of theory B's. All other things being equal, preferring theory A to theory B would seem most reasonable. Most philosophers assume this as a central assumption of doing metaphysics properly, for the additional posits of theory B do not explain or account for anything not already accounted for by the fewer posits of theory A. Thus, the additional posits of theory B should be deemed as merely putative posits and so eliminated from any adequate theory. So much the worse for a theory having merely putative posits. Having set forth a case for indeterminism, I will now endeavor to anticipate some possible objections. One such objection might be that the line of reasoning which leads us to indeterminism has absurdly skeptical consequences if taken too far. For example, if the goal is to have as few causal or deterministic relations as possible within one's ontology, then why not eliminate all of them? Why suppose that any events are caused or determined by preceding conditions? After all, saying that nothing is determined is even simpler than my view, which only says that decisions are undetermined, because, rather than eliminating some deterministic relations, it eliminates all of them. But this leads us to an implausible sort of Humean skepticism about causation, and since virtually no one wants to maintain that absolutely nothing is determined, perhaps we shouldn't be so zealous to remove deterministic relations from our ontology. In reply to this argument, I readily agree that I do not want to remove all or even most deterministic relations from our ontology just because that would be a simpler hypothesis. But why is that? Well, because I take it that I have good reasons for believing in most of them. For example, billiard balls never appear to move themselves across a pool table in an unmotivated fashion. They only ever appear to move across a pool table when they connect with another object. Moreover, they do so in ways which are correlated with the direction in which they are contacted, as well as the velocity at which they were contacted. So the best explanation for movement exclusively occurring under these specific conditions and with these suspicious correlations is that these conditions cause and determine the ball's movement. Similar arguments can be constructed to account for the movements of other non-agental objects. As O'Connor observes, I don't merely observe the movement of the hammer and then the movement of the nail. I perceive the hammers moving the nail. This apparent perception of causality could be mistaken, of course. Our experience cannot furnish the basis of a demonstrative proof. By the same token, our apparent perception of ordinary physical objects could also, in this epistemic sense, be mistaken. Yet few take that as a reason not to believe that we do perceive them. However, we are just not in that sort of situation when it comes to conscious beings like ourselves. Our decisions do not only occur when discernible antecedent conditions obtain, nor are our actions predictably correlated with their antecedent conditions. So the decisions of agents are very unlike the deterministic physical world of cause and effect. Obviously, that does not mean that the decisions of agents could not be determined as well. It just means that we don't have the same kind of reason to think that they are. As such, we have good reasons not to remove the deterministic relations associated with physical objects from our ontology, since we have good evidence supporting their existence. But when such evidence is not present, as is the case with the decisions of conscious agents, the principle of simplicity weighs against introducing deterministic relations unnecessarily. Therefore, the defender of my argument for indeterminism need not worry that this line of argument can be generalized to eliminate all deterministic relations from their ontology. It most certainly cannot. My abductive argument for indeterminism holds that indeterminism should be preferred over determinism on the grounds that it is simpler than determinism, assuming that all other things stand equal between determinism and indeterminism. But perhaps that assumption is not true. The determinist might want to maintain that it is not, in fact, the case that all other things stand equal between determinism and indeterminism. They might argue that the evidence in favor of determinism just outweighs simplicity considerations. There have been two influential arguments to this end, and I shall consider them now. The most common philosophical objection to an indeterministic notion of free will, by far, comes from the idea that it would be no better than random chance or blind luck. The argument typically begins with the skeptic drawing a dichotomy between an event's being determined and an event's being random, and says that all events must fall into one of these categories. But since indeterminism denies that decisions are determined, then it follows that they must be random. But is a sort of freedom which amounts to nothing more than brute randomness really something worth wanting? Surely indeterminists don't want their decisions to carry no more significance than random quantum events. But if the indeterminist does not want to say that their decisions are random, then they must bite the bullet and accept the other alternative, namely that their decisions are determined. Hence, determinism must be true. As Mark Balaguer explains, for each different conscious decision you've made in your life, we can say for certain that it was either caused by prior events or not caused by prior events. But if a decision was caused by prior events, then it wasn't a product of your free will because it was already determined by things that happened before you chose. And if a decision wasn't caused by prior events, then it wasn't a product of your free will because it happened randomly, and it makes no sense to say that you chose of your own free will if your choice just randomly appeared in your brain. Certainly at first blush, this appears to be a false dichotomy. The indeterminist is not likely going to accept that the only options for any decision are that it was determined or that it was random. As Robert Kane argues, the first step is to question the intuitive connection in people's minds between indeterminisms being involved in something and its happening merely as a matter of chance or luck. Chance and luck are terms of ordinary language that carry the meaning of its being out of my control, so using them already begs certain questions. Whereas indeterminism is a technical term that merely rules out deterministic causation, though not causation altogether. Indeterminism is consistent with non-deterministic or probabilistic causation, where the outcome is not inevitable. It is therefore a mistake, in fact one of the most common in debates about free will, to assume that undetermined means uncaused or merely a matter of chance. The theory of free will which I have developed specifies that a decision must be deliberate in order to be free. And so I would propose a third category in addition to determinism and randomness. A decision could be determined, or it could be random, or it could be deliberate. There does not appear to be any obvious problem with saying that free decisions fall into that third category. So it is tempting to just reject this most prominent argument against indeterministic notions of free will as a simple false dichotomy. As Stuart Goetz says, an agent's choice is not random because it is explained teleologically by a reason. Regrettably, philosophical debates are rarely ever settled this easily. The most likely response that the determinist will offer against the idea that deliberate actions are a genuine third option will be to construct a true binary between determinism and randomness. That is to say, they will most likely just define the category of randomness as anything which is not determined. So random just means not determined. Now this is of course a true dichotomy. An event can only be determined or not determined. But if there is a victory for the determinist here, it will ring rather hollow. For the defender of indeterminism will have no problem grasping the second horn of the supposed dilemma in this case. After all, to say that deliberate decisions are merely not determined is what the indeterminist has claimed all along. If the determinist wants to stretch the definition of randomness so thinly that it means nothing more than undetermined, then there is no longer any reason for the indeterminist to reject it. The only reason that the indeterminist originally resisted the idea that free decisions were random was because it was assumed that the word random was being used in the usual sense, where random means without forethought, concern, or intention. Once it has been stipulated that the word random is going to be broad enough to include those concepts, then there are no longer any negative consequences which emerge from saying that a free choice is random in the sense of merely being undetermined. Perhaps a more sophisticated move for the determinist to make would be to challenge the notion that a decision can be deliberate but not determined. To say that a decision is deliberate is to say that it is intentional or based upon some reason. So perhaps the determinist might maintain that if a decision is based upon a reason, then that reason somehow causes or determines which decision is made. But it surely will not work to say that a reason causes a decision, since the relevant sorts of reasons which I am talking about are not causal in nature. For example, if I choose to eat a hamburger rather than a hot dog, this choice might be based upon the fact that I desire a hamburger more than a hot dog. But the determinist hasn't given us any reason to suppose that this desire somehow causes my decision. As Timothy O'Connor argues, it is true that we cannot conceive an agent's causing an event internal to his action without having any inclination toward that action. To that extent, the agent's causing the event depends on the reason he has. Nonetheless, the explanatory power of reasons within an agent-causal framework is not independent of the agent's exercise of active power. The latter provides a necessary link between reason and behavior, without which the reason could not, in any significant way, explain the behavior. It allows the reason to influence the agent's producing the outcome, while not directly and independently causing it. Were nothing to have caused this, then noting that the agent had a reason that motivated acting in that way would not suffice to explain it. Nor is it clear how making a choice based upon a reason would determine that choice, such that the agent categorically could not have done otherwise. I see no logical contradiction involved in saying that an agent could choose one course of action over another based upon some reason, and yet that, up until the time of choosing, the agent retained a categorical ability to follow the other course of action. Reasons can incline us toward a certain course of action without thereby compelling or determining that course of action. As Thad Botham observes, this is a trivial case of reasons inclining without necessitating. Suppose that I'm inclined, moved, and motivated to drink the cup of espresso at the end of dinner. Nonetheless, I freely decide to abstain, freely opting for a glass of milk instead. Prior to the choice of milk over espresso, I have other inclinations and tendencies besides those that favor deciding on espresso. All of my inclinations and desires move me. That is just what properly functioning inclinations and desires do. Moreover, frequently I feel differences in the strength of my inclinations or desires, which push or pull me one way or another. Nonetheless, I might freely act for only some of those reasons. So there does not appear to be any logical constraint according to which basing decisions upon reasons would entail that the decisions are determined or caused by those reasons. So if the determinist wishes to maintain that a decision's being deliberate is not a genuine alternative to it being determined, he owes us an explanation for as to why. In summary, then, the most common philosophical argument against indeterministic free will appears to be predicated upon a false dichotomy between determinism and randomness. It overlooks the third possibility that indeterministic choices may be deliberate. If one makes this a true dichotomy, by simply defining randomness so broadly as to merely mean not determined, then there is no longer any problem for the indeterminist in grasping that second horn of the dilemma. If the determinist tries to argue that a deliberate decision is necessarily a determined decision, then they will owe us a demonstration that there is some sort of logical contradiction involved in holding that a decision can both be deliberate and indeterministic. Unless and until this is done, I conclude that the indeterminist has nothing to fear from this randomness argument. I previously considered an argument according to which an indeterministic notion of free will is incoherent because it would be no better than random chance or luck. I objected that this argument either depends upon a false dichotomy, or else it waters down the notion of randomness so far that the argument no longer has any bite. But while it might be true that there is nothing logically problematic about the sort of indeterministic account of free will which I am espousing, perhaps the determinist will argue that it has nevertheless been shown to be false by new developments in neuroscience. As Dirk Pereboom says, a case can now be made for the claim no objections canvassed so far show that agent-causal libertarianism is incoherent, at least in the sense that it involves no detected logical inconsistency. But this does not mean that it is in the clear. The request for more explanation of what agent causation is like can be regarded as part of an assessment of whether we have any reason to believe that agent causation exists, even if it is coherent. Accordingly, there are other ways in which one might attempt to undermine the hypothesis of agent causation. In my view, the most promising strategy would aim to show that although irreducible causal relations could, in principle, obtain between libertarian agent causes and events, in actual fact, there are empirical considerations that tell against this position. An often cited argument against indeterministic free will comes from a type of experiment first conducted by Benjamin Libet in 1983, with the results being duplicated in subsequent experiments. In these experiments, participants were told to move their wrist up when instructed to do so. Their brain activity was measured, and scientists could observe that there was a buildup of energy in the brain, what's referred to as readiness potential, several hundred milliseconds before the individuals became aware of their decision to move. This has been interpreted by many as evidence that the decisions which we make have already been decided prior to the time at which we make a conscious choice. As Robert Sapolsky concludes in a recent book on the subject, collectively, what does this Libetian literature, starting with Libet, show? That we can have an illusory sense of agency, where our sense of freely, consciously choosing to act can be disconnected from reality. We can be manipulated as to when we feel a sense of conscious control. Most of all, this sense of agency comes after the brain has already committed to an action. Free will is a myth. But do these findings actually challenge the idea that we have free will? In fact, their significance has been greatly oversold, and the results do not even challenge the idea that we have free will, let alone refute it. Alfred Millet has been a staunch critic of attempts to use the Libet experiments to disprove free will. He documents no less than 5 serious problems with making the leap to the conclusion that our decisions are determined from the results of these experiments. As such, I will be quoting heavily from his work on the subject. The first problem with using Libet's findings as an argument against free will is that this ignores the fact that the subjects of these experiments retained the ability to reject the decision to act even after the readiness potential was achieved. In other words, even after the decision was supposedly made, the subjects of these experiments were able to refrain from acting. Indeed, it was on the basis of this fact that Benjamin Libet himself did not conclude that his experiments proved determinism. As Millet rightly says, Libet believed that once we become aware of our decisions or intentions to do something right away, we have about 1/10 of a second to veto them. He thought free will might play a role in vetoing. As someone put it, Libet believed that although we don't have free will, we do have free won't. Second, and more seriously, this argument assumes that the energy buildup is itself identical to the decision which is made, but there is no reason whatsoever to grant that assumption. It is entirely possible that the readiness potential in the brain is simply what the brain does when an agent is preparing to make a conscious decision. The readiness potential need not be conceived of as being identical to the decision which is made. As Millet asks, but are decision and intention the most suitable mental items to associate with readiness potential onset? Again, Labette describes the relevant occurrence of which the agent later becomes aware, not only as a decision and the onset of an intention to move, but also as the onset of an urge, wanting, and a wish to move. This leaves it open that at negative 550 milliseconds, rather than acquiring an intention or making a decision of which he is not conscious, the agent instead acquires an urge or desire of which he is not conscious, and perhaps an urge or desire that is stronger than any competing urge or desire at the time, a preponderant urge or desire. It is also left open that what emerges around negative 550 milliseconds is a pretty reliable causal contributor to an urge. I believe that if Labette himself were to distinguish between intending and wanting, including having an urge, along the lines I sketched, he might find it more credible to associate the readiness potentials with the latter than with the former. Elsewhere he says, why should we think that a decision is made when the EEG rise begins? Maybe what's going on in the brain when the rise begins is a process that might, or might not, lead to a decision a bit later. And he goes on to conclude, the assertion that a process is initiated does not entail that it will be completed. This is a point to bear in mind. Labette himself appeals to grounds for believing that an act-now process that is initiated unconsciously may be aborted by the agent and therefore not be completed. That apparently is what happens in instances of spontaneous vetoing if act-now processes start when Labette says they do. Third, the experiments fail to acknowledge that there is room for free will to play a role between the readiness potential onset and the bodily movement. As Millet observes, processes have parts, and the various parts of a process may have more and less proximal initiators. A process that is initiated by an item in the pre-proximal intention group may have a subsequent part that is directly initiated by a consciously made decision. The conscious self, which need not be understood as something mysterious, might more proximately initiate a voluntary act that is less proximally initiated by an item in the pre-proximal intention group. The point to be noticed here is that from the datum that some neural events leading up to the movement begin before a conscious proximal intention emerges, one cannot legitimately infer that any of the following play no role in producing the movement: the acquisition of the proximal intention, the agent's consciousness of the intention, or the physical correlates of either of these items. Fourth, these experiments do not even establish that there is a general correlation between readiness potential and decisions, because the readiness potential was only recorded when a bodily movement was made. But for all we know, the brain could just be constantly having these sorts of energy buildups even when decisions are not being made. The bottom line is that we do not currently have enough information even to conclude that readiness potential is regularly correlated with decision making, let alone that the two are identical or that one causes the other. Again, Millet says, Labette's experiments used a signal to tell a computer to make a record of the preceding couple of seconds of electrical activity. The signal Labette used was the muscle burst. So we don't know whether sometimes, even though the person didn't go on to flex, there was brain activity like what was going on in the participants a half second before they flexed. If we want to find out whether brain activity at a certain time is well correlated with an action at a later time, we need to try to find out whether that brain activity sometimes happens and no corresponding action follows it. Labette didn't look for this. Because of his setup, records of electrical activity were made only when there was a muscle motion. For all we know, on some occasions, maybe many, There was a rise and no associated flexing action. Fifth and finally, there is a hasty generalization from the sorts of decisions studied in these experiments to all other human decisions. But such an inference is premature because there are important and relevant differences between the sorts of decisions which were being made during the Libet experiments and the decisions which we make in everyday life. Specifically, the test subjects were told to act instantly and without forethought. There were no reasons to make the choices which they made, and no rewards or punishments to motivate one choice over another. They were essentially just making decisions at random. But that's clearly unlike the sorts of decisions which we care about having control over in our everyday lives. The test subjects in Libet's experiments were encouraged to be random and not deliberate in their choices. As Millet contends, as a participant in Libet's experiment, you would arbitrarily pick a moment to begin flexing in order to comply with part of your instructions. There's no need at all for conscious reasoning about what to do. But in real-life situations in which we do reason consciously about what to do, the road to action seems quite different. It often seems a lot less arbitrary. If we want to know whether conscious reasoning ever plays a role in producing decisions, we shouldn't restrict our attention to situations in which people are instructed not to think about what to do. So there we have 5 serious problems facing the idea that Libet's experiments have disproved the existence of free will. Collectively, they demonstrate that it is time to leave these sorts of arguments against free will behind. Millet concludes the matter well, saying, "Does the brain decide to initiate actions at a time before there is any reportable subjective awareness that such a decision has taken place? Libet and his colleagues certainly have not shown that it does, for their data do not show that any such decision has been made before time W, or before the time at which their subjects first are aware of a decision or intention to flex. Nothing justifies the claim that what a subject becomes aware of at time W is a decision to flex that has already been made, or an intention to flex that has already been acquired, as opposed, for example, to an urge to flex that has already arisen. Indeed, the data about vetoing, as I have explained, can reasonably be used to argue that the urge hypothesis about what the readiness potentials indicate is less implausible than the decision or intention hypothesis. Now, there have been similar, more recent experiments conducted since the time of Libet, which have also been claimed to undermine the idea that we have free will. In particular, a 2008 study involving fMRI scans of the brain, which showed that decisions of the participants could be predicted up to 10 seconds in advance, has been touted about as evidence against the reality of free will. But in addition to these predictions being about only 60% accurate, Alfred Millet points out that the conclusions drawn from these experiments suffer from many of the same deficiencies as those drawn from Libet's. The main problems with Libet's version of the argument apply here as well. First, there is no good reason to believe that the early brain activity the scientists detected is correlated with an early decision. Second, spontaneous picking of a button or moment to press is so different from decisions that seem to flow from a careful weighing of pros and cons that it's a serious mistake to generalize from the alleged findings to all decisions. What happens in scenarios featuring spontaneous picking may be very different from what happens in scenarios in which we spend a lot of time and effort weighing pros and cons before we decide what to do. It is, in fact, highly dubious that scientific inquiry will ever be able to settle the question of free will. In order to prove that the brain could cause bodily movements without conscious intention, one would need to achieve the same bodily movements while blocking an intention from forming. But it seems unlikely that we will ever be able to ensure that condition. As such, those who go looking to neuroscience to settle the question of free will are, in my opinion, just barking up the wrong tree. As Richard Swinburne concludes, to show that an intention was irrelevant, a scientist would need to show that a particular kind of brain event causes the very same sequence of brain events with or without subjects having the requisite intention to produce that bodily movement, and so, with or without the bodily movement constituting an intentional action. It would only be possible to perform such an experiment to show this if scientists could prevent the occurrence of intention without thereby automatically preventing the sequence of brain events caused by the particular kind of brain event. That could only be done if either the intention is not caused by any brain event whatsoever, or it is caused by a brain event which is not part of the sequence. For only if intention is not caused by an event which belongs to the sequence could the intention be prevented without preventing the occurrence of the sequence of events which cause the bodily movement. As far as I know, no one has attempted to show this. This video has covered the intimidating topic of free will. I have tried to briefly introduce viewers to the major concepts and terms. I have proposed a broadly agent-causal account of free will, according to which a decision is free if and only if it is both deliberate and indeterministic. I have offered a modest abductive argument for why we should think that the controversial indeterministic component of my theory is true. This argument was based upon the observation that indeterminism is a vastly simpler theory than determinism due to its ability to remove a good number of determination relations from our ontology. I also covered the two most prominent objections to indeterminism. First, I dispelled the idea that indeterministic freedom reduces our choices to merely random events, arguing that it is based upon a false dichotomy between determinism and randomness. Second, I showed that the famous Libet experiments, and those that followed it, do not even suggest that we do not have free will, let alone provide proof of this. In conclusion, while the evidence is not strong either way, I think I have at least provided a plausible account of free will, and offered some good reasons to think that it is correct.